At the time of uploading, the nights are getting longer and the days are getting colder. So you know what that means. The holidays are almost upon us. So what better Batman villain to talk about than Mr. Freeze? Okay, yeah, I know, he's not exactly a festive villain. He is in essence a zombie snowman that laments the death of his beloved wife, but I think that's as close as we're going to get to festive cheer in Gotham City. By now, there have been dozens of videos talking about how Batman the Animated Series redefined the character of Mr. Freeze, changing him from a generic cold-themed villain to a wounded, tragic figure. The chances are, if you're even remotely interested in btas, then you know this already, so I'm not going to focus on that. Instead, what I want to talk about is the man himself and how his pain drives him to do awful things. So let's kick things off with his debut episode, Heart of Ice. So yeah, you know the story. A desperate scientist places his dying wife in suspended animation with the hope that he can revive her once a cure for her condition has been developed. Enter the heartless executive of the company he works for, demanding that the scientist stop wasting money on an unauthorized experiment. There is an argument, a struggle. The scientist ends up being bathed in chemicals, forever altering his body chemistry, making it impossible for him to survive outside of Subzero temperatures. And thus, Mr. Freeze is born. He now claims to be dead to emotion, frozen in time, with a burning desire for revenge against the man that wronged him. So the first thing to point out is that the titular Heart of Ice doesn't belong to Mr. Freeze. No, despite what he claims, he very clearly still experiences emotions. Despair and anger in particular, as well as a little joy as we see when he enacts his revenge. Notice how he slowly torments Boyle by freezing him from the feet up. If he really wanted him dead, he would have just frozen him headfirst, but Freeze wants to draw out Boyle's suffering. The actual Heart of Ice belongs to Ferris Boyle. He has no sympathy for Victor and Nora's plight. Instead, he barges into the lab accompanied by armed security, shouting about how he had ordered the project to be shut down because it was too expensive. When Victor explains that Nora's life depends on the procedure continuing, Boyle doesn't care. Even after he pushes Victor into the chemicals, there's no remorse on his part. He just sees the chemical fumes and orders his men to retreat. Ferris Boyle puts on a facade of a humanitarian, but in reality he's a soulless piece of crap. Hence why Freeze finds it so galling when Boyle is awarded the Humanitarian of the Year award. As an aside, kudos to Paul Dini, the writer of the episode, for making Mr. Freeze's nemesis be a dude named Boyle. You know, freeze as in cold and boil as in hot. Getting back to Mr. Freeze, the key thing that we learn about him in this episode is that he is incapable of coping with his grief. At this point, he believes that Nora is dead, and he uses a plastic woman inside of a snow globe as a substitute for Nora, speaking to it as if he were speaking to her. It's quite touching, Freeze showing his true emotions, namely his sadness to the snow globe because he can't speak to his wife. I know some people speak to their deceased loved ones, hoping that somehow their spirit can hear them, but Victor has to have a tangible object in order to feel like he's speaking to Nora. Something I find both interesting and a little challenging about Nora is the way that she is presented to us as a blank canvas. We only really see Nora in photographs. Even when she begins her treatment, we see the vague outline of a woman's body. We don't know anything about her at all. I talked about this in depth in a separate video a few months ago, so go watch that if you haven't already. But it's clear that Victor is devoted to Nora because he essentially throws his entire life away on the chance of preserving hers. So moving beyond that final scene from Heart of Ice with Freeze weeping to his dead wife, Mr. Freeze does make a return in the Adventures of Batman and Robin episode Deep Freeze. Now in this story, Freeze learns that Nora's body was recovered by industrialist Grant Walker and that there is a chance she could be revived. All Freeze has to do is help Walker escape death by recreating the accident that turned him into Mr. Freeze. With his newfound immortality, Walker then plans to freeze the world, killing billions of people. Sure, Freeze isn't directly responsible for Walker's actions, but he is aiding them. If Nora were to wake up in a world like that, essentially it's no different than the tank she's currently living in, except the entire world is now that tank. Freeze knows that Nora would never forgive him, and so he throws away his chance at saving Nora, because the price was simply too high. No matter which option he chooses, Nora will remain out of his reach, and so he opts to prevent Walker's scheme. The key thing about this episode is that Nora was intended to be dead, and that's why Freeze kneels before her corpse at the end of the episode. He's mourning her again, and that final shot with his gloved hand reaching out to the frozen Nora is a wonderful callback to Freeze's monologue from the end of Heart of Ice, where Freeze dreams of Nora's warm hand waiting to hold him. Except the reality is that Nora's hand is cold and out of reach, and it's all his fault. Before moving on to Freeze's next big on-screen appearance, I want to talk about a specific btas tie-in comic book, and that's the Batman Adventures Holiday Special. Fans of the show will likely know that this comic was adapted into the new Batman Adventures episode Holiday Nights, but the Mr. Freeze story from the comic book was sadly missing. The story begins with Freeze escaping from Arkham on Christmas Eve. Note that Freeze was being held in Stonegate Prison in Deep Freeze, so in my headcanon he was moved to Stonegate after this story took place. It's a genuinely touching story about Freeze escaping from Arkham simply because it wasn't going to snow that Christmas, and Nora had always loved it when it snowed on Christmas Eve. Freeze doesn't have any sinister motives, he's just going to use his massive cold gun to make it snow over the course of a couple of days. What's the problem, right? Of course, this is something of a running theme with Freeze. He doesn't consider, or maybe even care, about the impact his actions have on other people. We see a child narrowly avoid getting run over because a car skidded off the road in the sudden snowstorm. Likewise, the police that try to apprehend Freeze are just collateral damage to him. Freeze's motivations are touching, but that doesn't change the fact that he's actually quite cruel and selfish. Although I do enjoy the closing moments where Batman decides to talk to Freeze instead of beating him senseless. As I mentioned earlier, this story was removed when the comic was adapted as Holiday Nights. It wasn't necessarily because of concerns over runtime, although there definitely wouldn't have been enough time to include all 4 stories in a 22-minute time slot, but because some significant changes were made to Mr. Freeze thanks to the direct-to-VHS film Batman and Mr. Freeze, Subzero. This film was made to capitalise on the then upcoming live-action movie Batman and Robin. A little behind-the-scenes information is that director Boyd Kirkland's contract with Warner Bros. Was due for renewal, and part of his deal was that he would get to direct a feature-length Batman story. Originally, he and writer Randy Rogel put together a story featuring Bane. Bane would be an unstoppable force that would require Batman, Robin and Batgirl to team up in order to defeat him. At the same time, the relationship between Dick Grayson and Barbara Gordon would take centre stage, with Dick confessing to her that he was Robin. These plans had to be scrapped with the casting of Arnold Schwarzenegger, then the highest paid movie star in the world, as Mr. Freeze. So Randy and Boyd pivoted to doing a story about Mr. Freeze, picking up where he was left at the end of Deep Freeze. At this time, the other key members of the btas crew, like Bruce Timm, Paul Dini and Alan Burnett, were all busy working on other things, namely Superman the Animated Series. So they were not involved. Now, some fans cite this lack of involvement as a reason why Subzero shouldn't be considered canon. Totally is, by the way. And others complain that there's too much focus on Dick Grayson and Barbara Gordon with very little Batman, Robin and Batgirl. Yeah, which is true, I guess, but that's an entirely separate matter. Putting that aside, let's discuss the impact this film has on Mr. Freeze. So Subzero opens with Mr. Freeze out there living his life in the Arctic. He's got 2 pet polar bears, Notchka and Shaka, and has adopted an orphaned Inuit boy, Kunak. All things considered, Freeze seems to be living a pretty decent life with his pets, his son, and his beloved wife, frozen in suspended animation. It's a suitably twisted take on the traditional nuclear family. His domestic bliss is abruptly ended when a research submarine surfaces in his cave, causing Nora's tank to crack open, forcing Freeze to act quickly lest Nora dies. This is a completely different interpretation of the ending of Deep Freeze, one that Bruce Timm has bemoaned, stating the following.
The one story point that always sticks in my craw is that they brought Mr. Freeze's wife back to life. That's something that I never would have done because in my head she was dead. She wasn't just like preserved and on ice. She was dead. So to me, bringing her back to life, even though they did it for poignant reasons, it kind of made sense in the story that they were telling, but it was, well, that's kind of like Mr. Freeze's whole thing, is that his wife is dead. He froze emotionally because of it and everything. Well, now if she's back to life, it's like, well, now what is he?
It's kind of funny that because of rules imposed by broadcast standards and practices that you couldn't explicitly refer to death, they couldn't just come out and say that Nora was dead. They had to imply it. Maybe they were too subtle. I think it's more likely that the studio mandated that the film had to star Mr. Freeze, and Boyd and Randy realised that the only way forward for Freeze would be to bring his wife back. After all, Nora was Freeze's single motivator. Everything he did in the show was done to either avenge or protect her, and as one of btas's most significant and widely loved villains, it would be fitting for this feature film to finally give him some closure. So we're in a situation where Nora has been removed from her tank and needs to have an operation to recover, although this begs the question, why didn't she just have the operation earlier on? Perhaps the procedure didn't exist until more recently, I don't know. Regardless, the thing that's most interesting about this film is the way that it demonstrates Freeze's single-mindedness. He has no regard for bodily autonomy or women's control over their own bodies. Note that he lies to Barbara, telling her that he needs her for a blood transfusion. He doesn't even give Barbara the choice to help. Instead, he grabs her from a nightclub and takes her to his lab on an oil rig where she cannot possibly escape. Do we think that Nora would be okay with murdering someone in order to extend her life? I doubt it. Part of the problem is that we never see Nora, so we never learn what her wishes are. Maybe she's a deeply selfish person that would be completely fine with ending the life of another if it meant that she could continue breathing. We never know. Nora is presented as a pristine beauty frozen in time. This allows us, the viewer, to project onto her. This means that Nora is something different to each of us. Your read of Nora could very well be entirely different to mine. And that was very intentional. Now, at the film's climax, and I think it's important to note that Freeze entrusts Nora's safety to Batman. Yes, Freeze tumbles into the sea and disappears, but if he had concerns about Nora's safety, nothing would have stopped him from returning to her. I think by this point, after Batman risked his life to rescue both Nora and Mr. Freeze, he had earned Freeze's trust. Once Nora is saved, seemingly without stealing anyone's organs, Freeze heads off into the snowy tundra of the Arctic like Frankenstein's monster. He doesn't try to make contact with Nora again. Of course he wouldn't. What kind of life could they have together? And then there's the fact that he tried to murder the police commissioner's daughter. The moment he sets foot in Gotham again, he's going to jail for the rest of his unnaturally long life. But this walk into the tundra is not a walk of despair. It's a moment of joy for Freeze. We see him peering through the window to watch the news report about Nora's recovery, and tears of joy stream down his face. It's another neat callback to the end of Heart of Ice, except this time he isn't peering into a snow globe mourning his dead wife. He's out in the cold, looking in, feeling joy. In many ways, this would have been the perfect ending for Mr. Freeze. But then, this happened. Alright, so I make no secret of the fact that I think the new Batman Adventures is not as good as the original Batman the Animated Series. I understand why the art style needed to change to streamline production, making it harder for individual studios to turn in substandard work, but of all the changes made, what they did to Mr. Freeze is high on my list of gripes. In cold comfort, Mr. Freeze returns to Gotham to inflict his feelings of loss and despair on the people of Gotham City. He gatecrashes high-profile celebrations and destroys priceless artifacts like a dinosaur skeleton and a painting that had been commissioned to celebrate Gotham City, all so that other people can share his feelings of loss. At first, it's not clear why he's doing this. Maybe it's because Nora's remarried. But the real reason he's lashing out is because his body has degraded, leaving him as only a head in a jar with a mechanized body. Which is a reference to the early days of cryogenics, where it was claimed that rich people were having their heads frozen so that they could be revived in the future. See also Futurama. Freeze also surrounds himself with sexy hench girls, undoubtedly a response to Mr. Freeze's appearance in Batman and Robin, which, don't forget, hadn't come out while they were making this series. For all they knew, it was going to be a massive monster hit and redefine the public's perception of Mr. Freeze. But in this universe, it gives Freeze huge divorced dad midlife crisis vibes. His wife has left him, his body is not what it once was, so he lashes out at happy people, surrounds himself with younger women, and engages in some risky behaviour. Something that I've often wondered is why Freeze didn't just let the condition end his life. The fact that he lost his body and in his mind any chance of ever being with Nora again drove him to vengeful despair. This time it wasn't anybody's fault that it had happened to him, except maybe his own, and without anyone in particular to aim his anger at, he lashed out at anyone and everyone. His scheme to take from Batman what he loves most by freezing Gotham City and everyone in it is a huge betrayal considering everything Batman has done for him. Likewise, targeting Bruce Wayne, who funded Nora's treatment, seems out of character. Perhaps part of Freeze resents Bruce for succeeding in saving Nora, thus bringing his mission to an end. And without Nora to save, what is there to motivate Freeze? And that's generally what this episode is about. Mr. Freeze was a fan favourite villain and they wanted to use him more. But Subzero gave Mr. Freeze a definitive ending. He indirectly succeeded in saving his wife. He has no other reason to continue being a villain, so drastic changes were necessary. Some of the new Batman Adventures tie-in comics attempted to build on Freeze and Nora's relationship, with Nora tracking down Freeze to let him know she still loved him, but ultimately this would be undone with the more recent Batman The Adventures Continue comics. Nora's disease would return, and this time she couldn't be saved, which sets Freeze back on his villainous path. And this kind of feels a little bit like Paul Dini just pulling the plug on the events of Subzero, trying to pretend that it never happened. Now, before ending this video, there's one more Mr. Freeze appearance that I have to talk about, and that's the Batman Beyond episode Meltdown. The quick summary of the episode is that Derek Powers, who has been transformed into a radioactive monstrosity, Blight, wants to clone himself a new body and edit out the mutated genes, and then transfer his mind to that new body. In order to determine if the procedure is safe, he tests it on Mr. Freeze, whose head has been sitting in a jar in the Wayne Powers basement, presumably for decades. Initial results are very positive, with Victor Freeze restored to life, free from the curse of Mr. Freeze. Everything looks great! Victor even displays genuine remorse for his time as Mr. Freeze when one of his former victims attempts to murder him in a graveyard, arguing that it wasn't fair that he got a fresh start after Freeze had ruined his life. Victor shows tremendous compassion by insisting that Batman releases the man, apologises to him, stating that he can never truly make up for his past sins, but he's going to try. I have to wonder how Freeze would have reacted had Ferris Boyle said the same thing to him back in the day. Of course, with this being a Batman Beyond episode, we know that something horrible is bound to happen sooner or later. When Freeze starts relapsing, Powers orders Freeze be killed so that they can perform an autopsy to analyse his organs to see what went wrong. The look on Freeze's face when he realises that his new love interest, Dr. Lake, no relation, is trying to kill him. Oof. Of course, Freeze is able to escape and later returns wearing a new suit and sets about getting his revenge. He could have gone to the police, but instead he prefers to take matters into his own hands. As well as killing Dr. Lake, Freeze kills an undisclosed number of people by blowing the facility up while he was still inside of it. Freeze's response to the disappointment of his condition returning and the subsequent betrayal from Powers is to murder people and then kill himself. He's lived an unnaturally long life already, so the prospect of doing it again likely fills him with dread, but he is utterly incapable of letting a grudge go. And I really love this final section of the episode where Freeze drops to his knees after defeating Blight. The facility is about to explode, but Freeze is in no hurry to leave. When Batman pleads with him to get himself together and come with him, Freeze pointedly says,
"Believe me, you're the only one who cares."
It's such a bleak statement from a heartbroken, disappointed, defeated human being, and it tugs at my heartstrings every single time I watch it. Freeze just shoots up an icy wall, both figuratively and literally, and accepts his fate. It's quite rare for a Batman villain to be given such a definitive beginning, middle and end. After all, not many other classic villains made their way over to Batman Beyond, and that's what makes his character arc so satisfying. For as much as I didn't care for his appearance in Cold Comfort, without it we wouldn't have had this wonderful Batman Beyond ending for him. Mr. Freeze may have started out as a generic cold-themed villain in the comic books, but the versions seen in Batman the Animated Series, The Adventures of Batman and Robin, The New Batman Adventures, and Batman Beyond redefined him as one of Batman's most emotionally complex villains, cementing him as a fan favourite. Okay, that's the end of the video. Thank you very much if you made it all the way through to the end. Don't forget to do all the usual YouTube stuff, like, share, subscribe, comment, tell all your friends about me. I have enabled the super thanks button, so if you have the means to send a few bucks my way, I really appreciate it because I'm investing this money in better equipment. Hopefully you've noticed that the audio quality has been a bit better in recent weeks. I also want to say special thanks to Cat Strike for doing the music for this video. And one final plug, I have activated memberships on the channel, so for $1.99 a month you can get early access to my videos, exclusive community posts, emojis, and a little symbol next to your name on your profile, indicating that you are one of my backers. So next week I will be back to celebrate a very special milestone for Batman the Animated Series. It will be the 30th anniversary of the seminal Batman Mask of the Phantasm, so we're going to do a special video looking at the titular Phantasm. Hope to see you then.